Hi, folks, and welcome back to MMA Talking Heads. I'm Jason Probst, brought to you by MMAmania.com. Now we're returning a very good friend of the show and my original co-host, now a guest co-host on frequent occasion, Loretta Hunt, who is a familiar name to all of you who follow, read, know anything about MMA. Loretta, thank you for joining us in the wake of the Ronda Rousey-Liz Carmouche Women's MMA Extravaganza at UFC 157. What did you think of what transpired last night in Anaheim, and your thoughts on how this big promotional build-up turned out? Did it meet expectations?
I think so. I mean, the fight was good in itself. There was a little drama in it. It wasn't, Ronda steamrolling her opponent, Liz Carmouche. There was actually a moment where she was in trouble with the rear naked choke. So in terms of like dynamic of a fight, it worked, right?
Right.
And then I think what was probably the most impressive part of this whole puzzle was just the incredible amount of buildup that happened in those final few days going into the fight, and seeing Ronda Rousey everywhere in places where we've never seen MMA, period. CNN, Time Magazine, these are bigger mainstream outlets that don't really cover MMA often at all. And to see, Ronda Rousey's face, if you go to CNN right now, she's there. She's like a part of all the top stories, like her big shining smiling face. So I think that was probably the most impressive piece. I was saying to my husband this morning, it's ironic that in my opinion, from watching from the outside, this looks like the most attention MMA in general has gotten, male or female, for the UFC for sure. So, they were so adamant not to do a women's fight for so long. And then the irony is that this was kind of their key to maybe to the next level that they're trying to get to with the sport. We'll have to see. It's going to take a little while to see that. But in terms of that, I'm sure it was a success for them.
Well, an interesting thing is I always think about, the finale of The Ultimate Fighter 1, that great Forrest Griffin-Stephan Bonner fight, and how, at the right time you had an amazing event that really, transcended expectations. And I think this one really delivered as well. So you set the groundwork. You've proven that women can carry an event. Where do they go from here? I mean, they got Miesha Tate and Kat Zingano. They're going to tackle each other in April at the Tough 17 finale. Apparently, they've got like 10 women they're going to sign, or 5 that have signed. How do they build this thing from here and continue to kind of build on the momentum of tonight and sort of flesh this out? I mean, what do you think they're going to do? How do they proceed from here?
Yeah, well, honestly, they've got it all set up. I think Dana White said they have 10 women signed. I have to assume those are all 135ers right now. They're just going to concentrate on that one division right now. They have already that fight slated that you said, Tate Zingano in April. And then I saw Julie Kedzie got signed to the UFC.
Good. So
she'll be fighting over there. I saw that announcement this morning on her Twitter account. So she's probably one of the 10, which is good. I think she could definitely be in there. So now what happens is the UFC continues to put women's fights in their pay-per-view and maybe their Fuel and Fox cards. I mean, they've got all these platforms to start sending women's MMA through. And then at the same time, Shannon Knapp was very smart and came in at the right time and now has established a women's only MMA promotion. And they have this symbiotic relationship going already, Invicta and Zuffa, which is causing a lot of rumors.
Right.
But we can get to that. So, basically Invicta is a type of feeder league in general. Whenever the UFC wants to take someone from Invicta, so far it hasn't really been an issue. Shannon's been very amenable. And at the same time, Zuffa, Sarah Kaufman fought and then came back to Invicta, and a lot more people know who Sarah Kaufman is, because she fought for Strikeforce when Zuffa owned it. So they definitely got a good relationship going at the moment, and everything's set up for the UFC to take advantage of this now.
No, and I think it's a smart move by the UFC, especially, kind of the working with Invicta when it suits them. And yet at the same time, especially with a new commodity like women's MMA, you kind of let Invicta deal with the fits and starts and kind of the hits and the misses. And then they can kind of swoop in and kind of cherry pick, the better talent and the the bigger draws and put them on that bigger stage. But it's very interesting. I wonder, here's a question, a theoretical. If Invicta had never been formed, would women's MMA be in the UFC right now?
That's a good question. I think so. I mean, Ronda Rousey never fought in Invicta. She went right from Strikeforce to the UFC. So I think regardless, I think Ronda would have been fighting in the UFC. There was just too much attention for her. She reached her tipping point, which is when something becomes, you know, a social trend in a way, right? Like she tipped over into mainstream in the last few days is what I saw. So that's it. Ronda's out there. Everyone knows who she is. She is technically becoming a household name in terms of top, you know, female athletes worldwide. So I think it would have happened anyway. But it's great that Invicta exists because Invicta is starting to pull in women from all over the world, intriguing women, women that are interesting fighters. And, you know, it's a great place for them to go. And then maybe they go on to the UFC. Maybe they don't, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that, you know, I mean, you've interviewed Ronda a lot, spent a lot of time with her and her mom and her family. How do you think, you know, is she 25 years old? How do you think she's going to deal with all this exposure and kind of the pressures of, you know, kind of being the anointed one now? I mean, obviously the fight, and we want to get into that a little bit too, showed some holes in her game that she may need to work on. Obviously, she won in impressive fashion once again by armbar, but she did a great job promoting this fight. But how do you think she's going to respond to kind of the station now? I mean, is she kind of cut out for this? Because she kind of agitated, made a name for herself, you know, talking a lot of smack on Twitter, being kind of a persona after fights, but she's backing it up. Do you think she's going to continue that way and kind of play a little bit of the sort of the edgy heel, you know?
I was going to say edgy is kind of the best word for her.
Yeah.
First of all, Ronda's very complex. She's different, you know, at different times, or at least from what I've seen in my interaction with her. Like any human, right? They're not always the same way all the time. But she definitely has a little bit of edge to her. You know, she's a little pointed sometimes with the way she speaks to people. She's also very, very, very good about, you know, throwing out zingers off the top of her head, which is great. That's a great ability to have, you know, and a lot of athletes don't have that. So for her, that's going to push her even farther. You know, I think as long as she stays who she is, you know, she'll be, I think, mostly liked. You know, people will respect her for just being, you know, such a glass ceiling shattering athlete. And then there'll be a few people that she rubs the wrong way, you know, but that's pretty much any celebrity, I think. Except for like,
it never cost Tito
Sandra
Ortiz.
Bullock, maybe.
Right? It never cost Tito Ortiz any money rubbing people the wrong way. I mean, he was kind of...
Yeah, no, I think it's better to get some kind of emotion out of the fan, you know? Right. Overall, I like Ronda, you know? She's had a very tough road, you know? And this didn't happen overnight to her. She made a lot of sacrifices to get to the Olympics in judo. That's the top level. That's as far as you go with judo. And then after that, you know, she basically had a year to get things going with MMA. I think her manager, Darren Harvey, did a great job. And you know, and now she's here. Now she has this great career, and she's got to be a millionaire by now. I mean, or the checks are on their way, right. You know?
I mean, just you know, she's photogenic. She gives a meaningful interview. I mean, you know, I think it's refreshing when athletes don't kind of spout the sort of canned cliches. You never really know what's going to come out of their mouth. But when you back it up, I mean, that's what I remember about, you know, when Tito burst on the scene in the, you know, the late 90s. I mean, he, you know, wearing the T-shirts, talking smack to the Lions then, but he went in there and he kicked the crap out of people, you know, and I think it's very interesting to see where she goes from here. So speaking of the roster, he has some talented people on the roster. Somebody I'm high on is Sarah McMahon, a 2004 Olympic wrestler. I believe she was a silver medalist. Misha Tate, who's already fought, you know, Ronda once. But realistically, on this landscape, is there anybody? Do all roads point towards a super fight with Christian Santos? I mean, is this what you think the UFC is going to build towards in this next year or so? And I mean, does that happen? Is Ronda going to move up in weight? Is somebody going to have to come down to meet in the middle? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I know for sure, as much as I can know, that Chris Santos can't make 135, and I don't think she can make 140 either. I'm not really quite sure what was behind Tito Ortiz, who's now her manager, saying that maybe they could meet halfway at 140. From what I've been told, I don't think that's possible. I've also been around Chris. She's got a big frame, so I'm not sure that's physically possible. Also, she's missed weight before,
Right.
We're
At 145.
Yeah, who's missed 145, and got caught for a steroid type substance that she said she was taking to keep her weight down. So, I mean, the fans saying that she's ducking Ronda because she can't get down to 135, that's not really fair. But I'm not saying that Ronda has to go back up to 145 to fight her, only if Ronda wants to. And I think if the fans keep asking for that fight, it will definitely eventually happen. Well, Zuffa will do everything under their power to make sure it happens. And, right now, Chris can go back to Invicta. She can get back in the game. She hasn't fought in over a year. She's going to be a little rusty. Sure. I think there's some interesting opponents for her over at 145. We're probably going to discover another, 145 or two as Chris moves through that division and Invicta. And, I think after Ronda cements a couple wins, and if she keeps on winning, I think people are going to keep clamoring for that fight. And Zuffa will do everything in their power to let it happen. I think the end game is Tito and Chris want to eventually come back to the UFC, but they just want to come back on their terms. They didn't like the terms that the UFC was offering right now, but it's not by no means over. I think they'll get back there eventually.
What were those terms? A long contract or conditions or stipulations, or what was the deal there?
From what we were told by Ortiz and Chris in public was it was an 8-fight contract. And I think like the relationship with Invicta and the UFC, this is how it was going to work in this particular situation. She was going to sign with the UFC, but then I think she was going to be farmed out to Invicta, probably with Zuffa paying the purses. They've done things like this before, and then she would get some build-up fights in Invicta, and I think at the same time they'd figure out the weight situation and and where her and Ronda meet at just the right moment where everyone goes bananas. So those are all the things that promoters think about. No,
it would be huge. I mean, the thing about that fight is if you built towards it correctly, I mean, it could be women's MMA's version of Pacquiao and Mayweather. I mean, and I really mean that. I mean, it would be huge. But here's the same thing, though. Ronda really, at this point, she really doesn't have much stand-up. She's, a little bit one-dimensional, even though that one-dimensional is head and shoulders technically above everybody she's faced. Cyborg is, hits like a dude. I mean, a lot of stand-up in women's MMA is pretty primitive, frankly, but Cyborg really, really bangs people. I mean, she hits people hard enough to make you think, oh my God, someone's punching a woman in the face. You know what I mean? It's rough.
She's a bully, and I don't think Ronda's faced a bully yet. Someone who can go in there and really take control of a fight.
Right.
Ronda's always been in that position, except for last night. We saw her a little out of control, right? We saw Liz Carmouche back. We saw Ronda's face going bluish white.
Right. She hung in there.
It's like, this woman's, I said she's definitely not going to tap out.
Right.
But, she might fall over if she doesn't get out of the hole. Like she did. She willed herself out of it. I mean, this is a girl who has really risen to the occasion all her life, right? This girl has exceeded expectations time and time again. She just has an iron will, and that's going to be one of her assets. Last night, that was the asset that helped her the most.
And you know who she probably has to thank for that? It's her mom, right? Because wouldn't her mom come up to her on the couch and, like, choke her, just surprise her?
Her mom would make her practice judo over and over and over again. Her mom would make her, practice when she was hurt and, and would send her overseas when she was sick, just to tell her that there's never going to be a perfect situation for fighting and you have to be ready for anything. So, and that's a good lesson for life too, right? Sure. There was a time where Ronda was living out of her car, she said, and working 3 jobs. Right. And a year later, she's a millionaire on every single magazine because she had a goal. She said she was going to make it to the UFC. Her manager said it too. He really believed in her. And after I spent some time with Ronda, I was like, yeah, this is the girl that's going to go to the UFC. This is the one that's going to open the door. There's no doubt about it. So we've got a very special, unique woman in this moment in the sport.
No, and it's really big. And see, if I'm her management, I hold off on the Cyborg fight. I think that maybe a year, year and a half is good to, let Ronda get acclimated, let her continue to work on her stand-up. Because for what it's worth, the footage I saw of her hitting the mitts in the UFC primetime special, she does have, she obviously has phenomenal core strength in judo, which I think can translate into some stand-up. She needs to get, comfortable with it. And once she gets that, then you throw her in there with Chris Cyborg. And I think it's good to just give her, defend against Miesha Tate or take on Sarah McMahon, who's very tough. Sarah McMahon's manager, Monty Cox, once told me, he's like, she would throw Ronda on her head. She was an Olympic wrestler. I'm like, well, managers talk, whatever. Although Monty is rarely prone to hyperbole. But there's going to be a lot of women that are world-class grapplers, and that are going to come in. So I think it's good. You build her up and give her a year and then, throw her in there with Cyborg. But just as kind of some closing thoughts. Being a female journalist and kind of a sport and a media that's, pretty much dominated by men. What were your thoughts? What were you feeling as these two women came into the cage and not only the first for women's MMA, but a championship belt, all these expectations on the line, a pay-per-view, and they delivered? Did you really ever think this would happen? And how many years ago did you start thinking it really was viable?
Yeah, I thought it was going to happen. The easy answer would be for me to say it was very exciting. It was a milestone moment. Yeah, it all was, but it wasn't something I didn't expect. It was neat. It was, don't get me wrong, it was neat to watch the pay-per-view last night and see the women backstage and, see the women come to the cage and, walk into the octagon. All that stuff was neat, but I always knew it was coming. I knew like a couple years ago when women's MMA kind of started to come together a little bit. And I think Strikeforce, Elite XC, even HDNet for showing women's fights, on TV. All these outlets helped us get to this moment, Yeah, I just kind of knew it was on the way. I think, there had to be that right person to, bring it through. Like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So we kind of needed that. We needed that one person to walk through, that one person where the general public would be okay, like Ronda's very beautiful, but she's also very tough, People didn't go into last night's fight being like, oh, I think she's going to get annihilated and, and I don't want to see women fight. We had a few of those, but not a lot. People were willing to kind of accept it. There was also like a lot of luck this weekend with Danica Patrick in the Indy 500.
How great
there was
is that?
all synergy, right? There was all this breaking barriers, theme going on, right? So, and I think like the big outlets like CNN and others, they were actually pairing the two stories together. That's mainstream, that was love, but it kind of all came together. So it was just meant to be, No,
and I think it's, I always look back to the finale of The Ultimate Fighter 1 and think, what if Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar had been a terrible 3-round snoozer? I'm like, would the sport be where it's at today? Yeah, it would probably just be a year or two behind, and sometimes you really need to strike, at the precise moment. And I think Rousey and Carmouche really deliver that. So anyways, thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you, Loretta. Fans, if they want to get hold of you or send you messages on the internet or the Twitterverse, where can they reach you?
I'm at Loretta Hunt MMA.
Awesome. And thanks so much for joining us again, folks. You can catch us weekly in our installments of MMA Talking Heads at MMAmania.com. And will you see you next week on Talking Heads?